Welcome to another HRO Today educational podcast. In this series, we aim to provide you the latest workforce management approaches and best practices in HR. I'm Debbie Bola, Editorial Director of HRO Today magazine. In the past, publicly traded companies were required to disclose very little about their employees and their workforce. But all that changed in 2020 when the SEC announced a mandate that added human capital resources as a disclosure topic. Metrics providing transparency around talent acquisition, retention, development, and more may become a standard in annual reporting. So where should organizations begin? What steps do they need to take? And what does this mean for the future of HR? Through his partnership with CRI, David Simmonds is here with me today to provide insight and guidance on this important topic. David is the chairman of HCM Metrics, the leading global expert on HCM reporting regulations and standards. He is the first accredited lead auditor for the ISO standard for human capital reporting in the world. It is the first international standard that allows an organization to get a clear view of the ROI of its human capital. David, thanks for joining me today. How will the SEC's recent ruling impact HR leaders?
Thank you, Debbie. That's an amazing question, and grateful that you asked it. Yes, and it's very timely because the SEC changes to their regulations came in just a very few weeks ago. The Securities and Exchange Commission have changed regulations to the disclosure of human capital for every organization that is listed on the stock exchange in the US. And this is now mandatory, it's compulsory, it's required that every organization should now share publicly the information they've got about their people, their employees. It will impact the HR leaders in a number of different ways. It will help the HR leaders sort out the kind of reporting that they need to do internally. And we're talking about best practice. We're talking about what is good for the organization to begin with. Personally, I believe that this will ramp up the reputation of HR function so they can get to where they've aspired to for so long. It's no secret that some HR functions have been not necessarily trusted by the employees and not necessarily respected by the employers. But what this ruling will do is to change that so that HR is now front and central, so that the C-suite will be asking HR for information about how the HR function is operating. And for the first time, people will be starting to talk about the ROI, the return on interest, the return on investment for the HR function. And I think what it's going to do also is to help stakeholders internally, but also externally. And I think what it will do is that current or potential investors who have been asking for information for years, they'll now be given information in the same way that happens with the court of law, so that both sides have access to the same information. It's a level playing field, and potential investors will now be able to compare and contrast apples with apples rather than apples with pears. There are two very important aspects to the SEC regulation change. And I'm particularly pleased that Jay Clayton, the chairman of the SEC, he didn't prescribe specific areas or aspects for an organization to disclose. Quite the contrary, he made it quite broad. And I think this is good because this is where HR can now take accountability and responsibility for their disclosure. However, there are two important elements in what he said. Firstly, he said that it's based on principles. So what are those things that HR would normally be reporting on internally, whether it's to do with leadership or health and safety or diversity or turnover? These are the things that he would expect to see disclosed. And he would expect those to be disclosed against certain metrics, both qualitative and quantitative metrics. And he would want to see those metrics standardized across quarters and across years. The second important element that he spoke about was materiality. And in relation to these regulations, as far as he's concerned, materiality concerns a potential investor. What would the average investor expect to see? And I think those two elements are the elements that HR leaders need to apply themselves to going forward.
Now, with this in mind, how should HR leaders prepare?
Well, in terms of preparation, I think there's nothing like preparation, and without preparation, you cannot undertake any plans. There are a number of things that CHROs, leaders, HR directors should do in order to prepare for a report, whether it's the annual or the quarterly report. And going forward, the disclosure of human capital will need to be included in that report. And I think one of the first things the CHRO need to do is to acquaint themselves with what goes into their reports. So it, by necessity, will include much closer cooperation and discussion and collaboration with other members of the C-suite, particularly the CFO and the CEO. Secondly, I think that CHROs need to be aware of the kinds of areas that need to be reported on. And what this will do is to focus people's attention on how to do reviews, how to do audits of the HR function. The kinds of areas which we're encouraging at HCM Metrics would be all the normal functions which HR have been embracing for many years. That's to say, it would be recruitment, mobility, turnover, maybe leadership, diversity, health and safety. It could include organizational culture, for example. These are standard things which HR is doing, but now need to embrace and report upon. And I would suggest that the third thing that CHROs need to do is have a good look at other reports coming out of competitors, collaborators, and suppliers in order to know what they should be reporting on. We're talking about good practice. We're talking about areas of excellence. So when an investor or a stakeholder is looking at what the reports are saying, they will begin to make demands upon what needs to be reported on.
In terms of reporting, what specific metrics do you recommend for collecting data on?
There are, in fact, many hundreds of different metrics, and we were talking to some major HCM platform providers a while ago, and we said that the metrics that are currently being offered by most HR information systems and HCM platform providers are good. Most HR information systems provide reports which are great. It could be the cost of hire or the speed of hire. It could be how many women in the organization, how many accidents they've had. All of these are very standard and very easy. However, most of the major players in the field do not look at the qualitative metric. And this is something that Jay Clayton has said he wants to see. So, for example, in the organizational culture, he would expect to see reporting on employee engagement and experience. In the area of leadership, for example, in addition to the normal things like span of control or leadership development, which are quite easy to ascertain, he would also expect to see something, for example, on leadership trust or 360-degree feedback. And even in the area of recruitment and selection, it's not just the quantitative areas, but it's also the qualitative aspect. So, for example, it's not just cost of hire, but also quality of hire. Now, my background is in the area of learning and development, and oftentimes my colleagues in recruitment, they would spend a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of resources on recruiting, say, a middle manager. And then as part of the onboarding process, I would be asked to try and keep that person. It's about labor retention. The problem is that sometimes, with the best will in the world, people would be recruited into the wrong job, with the wrong manager, in the wrong location. The job may have been oversold, and very quickly the person may leave. And the blame would sit fairly with learning and development rather than with recruitment colleagues. Whereas if you have some metrics which go across not just quantitative data but qualitative data, then you can begin to do something that what we call triangulation, where you're bringing to bear verification and validation. You're looking at aspects of reliability and currency. You're looking at trends. You're looking at different sources of data. Now, in the standard ISO 30414, which has come out in the recent past, there are 11 core areas, and underpinning those core areas, there are 60 metrics. And so for the first time, we can measure aspects of recruitment and onboarding and compensation and benefits. We can actually measure aspects of learning and development and succession planning. And these metrics undergird the 11 core areas. The formulae are available, and we at HCM Metrics would be more than happy to help organizations have a look at these.
Now, what do you think this change means for the future of HR?
Well, this is a golden opportunity. The whole world has been suffering with COVID-19, and one of the benefits of what has been happening is that it's pushed HR to front and central. People are actually coming to the HR function and asking them about redundancies, about the workforce, about remote working, about the future of work. And I think this is brilliant. And what these metrics do, what the SEC ruling does, what the ISO standard does, is to give HR the ammunition, if you will, the evidence, the data, the metrics, the analytics, so that now we can move from a transactional basis of hiring and firing and putting HR where it's supposed to be, adopting its role as an organizational strategic partner for change. And what we're going to find is that in future, HR leaders will be invited into the board, into the C-suite, which is what we've wanted for so many years. The problem's been in the past that people at board level have been talking a different language. People at C-suite expect to be able to talk about graphs and charts and numbers and spreadsheets, whereas in the past, many people in the HR function have stayed away from this. The changes to the SEC ruling, the changes that come with metrics, and the changes that come with the ISO standards now mean that the HR function can lead strategic organizational change. And I think that's going to be good, because it's not just for its own sake. My particular passion happens to be that I want to drive change at the organizational and even national level to do with HR, whether it's looking at skill shortages or the gig economy, whether it's looking perhaps at how we better use our people across countries. And this will help in all of those areas. Another way that HR can be helped is to actually look forward and not just always backward. So it becomes proactive and not just reactive. One of the things that we're doing in HCM Metrics is to offer the possibility of prescriptive analytics. So we're not just reporting always on the past or trying to predict the future. We can actually prescribe now with a great degree of accuracy. Once we have access to the database, then we can use fairly sophisticated statistical modeling and we can determine the future. Up to now, most HR functions haven't been able to do that with any degree of reliability. But now what we can do, we can go to the CEO, we can go to the CFO and say, well, this time next year, we can predict with about 75% accuracy how many people have been promoted, how many people have left the organization because they weren't promoted. We can say how many people are likely to have accidents, which people have been on which training programs and what they thought of it and have they applied it. And we can even say how many women this time next year will be on maternity leave and they haven't even conceived yet.
Wow. Well, that will be a pretty impressive way to leverage data and analytics in the future. Thanks, David, for your time and insight today. Until next time, listeners, I'm Debbie Bola.